In a previous video, we focused on what civil rights are and where they come from. This video is going to focus real quick on how, over the course of American history, what level of government that has had to offer those protections has sort of like changed and evolved. So, this video really kind of focuses on, again, what level of government has to offer you those protections. So the initial interpretation, or like the original interpretation, is from like 1868 and before. So the original interpretation involving like the courts and what level of government had to follow civil liberties or offer civil liberties to citizens was that it was really just something that the national government had to abide by, right? So that the national government had to provide all of those protections, like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, right to bear arms, like all of the things that are civil liberties, that the national government had to basically provide those protections, but that the state governments didn't necessarily have to protect them. The two levels of government were almost following different rules. And part of that is because of the actual wording of the Constitution. So if you look at like the actual like first amendment, it says things like Congress shall make no law establishing or respecting the establishment of religion. So it's basically like saying like Congress has to give you freedom of speech rights, which it specifically mentions Congress. It doesn't say like Congress and the states. So the way that the courts originally interpret the Constitution is that the Bill of Rights only applies to the actions of the national government, like not necessarily the actions of the state governments. And like we had already talked about John Marshall at the beginning of the year and how most of his decisions sort of like dealt with the national government. And this is sort of reinforced by like one of his decisions, Barron v. Baltimore, which you don't need to know the details of the case, and it's not one of the mandatory cases this year. But that sort of like reinforces like this viewpoint that it's only the national government that its actions are governed by like the Bill of Rights. That the Bill of Rights really has no bearing on the actions of like the state governments. So kind of limited in who's protected. The current interpretation and how it has changed has been since 1868. So the new interpretation is that the national and the state governments have to provide you like basic civil liberties, and that the Bill of Rights has, which has always governed the actions of the national government, also applies to the state governments as well. And this interpretation changes with the passing of the 14th Amendment in 1868. So the 14th Amendment is important for a bunch of different reasons, and we've already focused on the equal protection clause in the 14th Amendment, how it relates to the gerrymandering cases involving discrimination, and we'll talk more about the equal protection clause part of the 14th Amendment when we talk more about civil rights. But the part of the 14th Amendment that is relevant to this debate is what's referred to as the due process clause. So if you look at like after the dot 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 under the 14th Amendment, it says, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. That's kind of become nicknamed the due process clause because of the wording. And with the passage of this amendment, courts now begin to interpret that little clause as meaning the national government, which has always had to follow like the Bill of Rights, still has to. But now, because the word state is specifically mentioned in this amendment, now the state government also has to provide those protections. And there's a fancy government word for this. It's called incorporation. Incorporation means that the state governments have to follow like the Bill of Rights and provide all of those civil liberties as well. So that's like the key word is when you see incorporation, that basically means that the Bill of Rights now have to be followed by the state governments as well because of the due process clause in the 14th Amendment. Except the difference is that there's something called selective incorporation. It's not like we just snap our fingers and all of a sudden like all of the amendments now are retroactively applied to like the state governments. What has to happen is one by one now, an individual in a state has to accuse the state government of violating that particular right. A court case is heard, and as long as the person is declared the winner against the state, that amendment is now called what we call selectively incorporated, meaning that from this point forward, the states cannot like not provide that protection that's found in the Bill of Rights. So like you can basically see like starting with the First Amendment and going all the way through like the Second Amendment in 2010, individual cases had to be heard in which a state citizen is alleging that their state government is violating one of these basic rights. And once the decision goes in favor of the citizen against the state government, that amendment is now incorporated. So instead of like snapping our fingers and having it all happen at once, we selectively apply that amendment to the actions of the state government as there's an individual case that is heard related to like that amendment and a particular part of that amendment. Right. So again, the takeaway from this video is initially only the national government had to follow the rules that are basically like listed in the Bill of Rights. And because of the 14th Amendment due process clause, it now also applies to the actions of the state governments as well.